Last night, after taking the kids out for trick-or-treating, I had the most terrifying experience of my life. To give you some context, I am a 42-year-old man, and I thought I had seen it all until last night. It was around 10:30, and I was just lounging on the couch, watching some late-night television. All of a sudden, I heard a loud boom, 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 boom. Someone was pounding on my front door like they were trying to break it down. My heart skipped a beat, and I was instantly on edge. I quickly ducked down and peeked out the front windows, hiding behind some houseplants, hoping whoever was out there could not see me. My living room is elevated about 10 feet off the ground, since I live in a split-level house, so I had a decent vantage point. I could not see anyone, but there was a black mid-size SUV parked in my driveway, its lights and hazards flashing ominously. Given that it was Halloween, my mind started racing through every horror movie I had ever seen, imagining the worst possible scenarios. Then it hit me. I had forgotten to lock the back patio door, which is always a pain to secure. Panic set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. I crept down into the basement to grab a piece of wood that I could use to jam the door shut. As I was coming back upstairs, I suddenly heard two loud bangs on the basement window, which is partially above ground because of the split-level design. My heart was pounding in my chest. I bolted up the stairs, wedged the piece of wood into the sliding door track, pulled the blinds closed, and started turning off all the lights as I tiptoed back upstairs to the living room. From the shadows of my darkened living room, I watched as the SUV slowly pulled out of my driveway, moving at a crawl. It was almost as if they were reluctant to leave. About an hour later, when things finally seemed to calm down and my nerves were starting to settle, I was sitting on the couch, lights off, trying to focus on the TV. Then I noticed headlights sweeping across the ceiling, signaling that a car was pulling up my inclined driveway once again. I looked out the window and sure enough, it was that same black SUV. This time, I was genuinely terrified. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Convinced that I was about to become the subject of next year's Halloween horror stories. On my knees, I peered through the houseplants in the window, watching the vehicle intently. No one got out. I could not make out the make or model, let alone the license plate. It was too dark. All I could see was this black SUV sitting in my driveway, its lights and hazards still on, the bumper almost touching the front step, a mere 4 feet from my door. They just sat there doing nothing, not even getting out of the car. I was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, trying to explain what had happened earlier and what was going on now. Then just as slowly as before, the SUV reversed out of my driveway and drove off into the night. About 20 minutes later, I saw the deputy's car rolling through our small subdivision. Our neighborhood is pretty isolated, with just one way in and one way out, making it feel even more unsettling. As the deputy circled back down the road, I noticed my landlord, who lives next door, heading out to grab his mail. I decided it was time to step outside and let them both know what was going on. When I opened the front door, I froze. There was a note taped to it, and it simply read, "Derek, we are going to kill you." My stomach dropped. The thing is, I am not Derek. I do not know anyone named Derek, and I have no clue why someone would think Derek lives here. Shaking, I hurried over to the deputy and my landlord, showing them the note and explaining everything that had happened that night. The deputy immediately called for backup. They took the note as evidence and started asking me and my landlord a bunch of questions. Whether we knew anyone named Derek, whether anyone had any reason to want to hurt us, if there were any shady dealings going on. One of the deputies pulled me aside and started asking more personal questions. If I owed anyone money, if I had any enemies, or if I was involved in some kind of love triangle. I told him no, no, and no. I am just a regular guy who does not have any enemies that I know of. The deputy assured me that they would keep a patrol car in the area and told me to call 911 if anything else happened. My landlord, who was just as shocked as I was, swore up and down that he had never rented to anyone named Derek and had no idea what was going on. This morning, I was in my home office, which is right next to that patio door I had jammed shut the night before. It was freezing cold in there, which was odd. When I opened the blinds, I was hit with a wave of dread. The sliding door was open about 4 inches. Someone had tried to get in, even after I had secured it with that piece of wood. I immediately called my landlord, and he was just as freaked out as I was. He came over and installed a better lock on both my patio door and his. He also built us both sturdier door jambs to keep anything like this from happening again. But the fear is still there. Every creak, every shadow feels like it could be the start of something terrible. And the worst part? I still have no idea who Derek is, or why someone wants him dead. The next day, I could not shake the eerie feeling that had settled over my home. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, making it hard to concentrate on anything else. I kept thinking about that note. The way it was taped to my door was such intent, like whoever left it knew exactly what they were doing. It was not just a prank. It felt personal, even though I had no connection to this mysterious Derek. I decided to do some digging on my own. I figured if the police were not going to get to the bottom of this quickly, maybe I could. I started by asking around the neighborhood, casually bringing up the events of the night before in conversation, but no one seemed to know anything about a Derek. Some of my neighbors had not even noticed the black SUV, which made me feel even more isolated in my fear. It was as if I was the only one living in a nightmare while everyone else went on with their lives. That night I could not sleep. Every little sound in the house set me on edge. The wind howling outside, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, they all seemed magnified in the dark. I kept replaying the events of Halloween night in my head, trying to make sense of them. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why had the SUV come back? Why had they left without doing anything? And most importantly, why had they left that note? As the clock ticked past midnight, I finally gave up on sleep and got out of bed. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept in the closet, just in case, and started doing a walkthrough of the house, checking the locks, peering out of the windows. Everything seemed normal, but that did little to ease my nerves. Then as I was standing in the kitchen, something caught my eye. It was a piece of paper lying on the floor near the back door, the same door I had jammed shut with the piece of wood. My heart began to race as I bent down to pick it up. It was another note, just like the first one. This time it read, "You cannot hide, Derek. We will find you." I dropped the note like it had burned me and backed away, my mind racing. How had it gotten inside? The door was still locked, the wood still jammed in place. But somehow someone had managed to get this note inside my house without making a sound. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. They promised to send someone over right away, but I could tell from their tone that they were not taking it as seriously as I was. To them, it was just a strange case of mistaken identity. To me, it felt like a death sentence. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by the time they got there, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me feeling drained and paranoid. I handed over the note and told them about the earlier events, how I had double-checked all the locks, how the note should not have been able to get inside. They took it seriously enough, but I could tell they were skeptical. They searched the house from top to bottom, even going outside to check the perimeter, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. One of the officers suggested that maybe I had overlooked something, that maybe the door had not been as secure as I thought. But I knew what I had done. I knew how tightly I had jammed that piece of wood into the sliding door track. Someone had been inside my house without leaving a trace, and that thought alone was enough to make my skin crawl. Before they left, the officers assured me they would increase patrols in the area and urged me to call them again if anything else happened. But as they drove away, I was left feeling more vulnerable than ever. It was like they had taken my sense of security with them when they left. That night I barely slept, constantly jolting awake at the slightest sound. I kept the baseball bat close at hand, but I knew it would do little good against whoever or whatever had gotten into my house without a trace. The next day I was a wreck. I could barely focus on work, my mind constantly drifting back to the notes, to the black SUV, to the possibility that someone was watching me even now. Every time the phone rang or there was a knock at the door, I jumped, half expecting to find another note, or worse, someone standing there with malicious intent. That evening, as I sat in my living room, trying to calm my nerves with some mindless TV, I noticed something strange. The curtains in my office, the ones I had pulled tight that morning, were slightly parted, just enough for someone to see inside. I got up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked over to the office. The room was dark, the only light coming from the streetlights outside. I reached for the curtains, intending to close them properly, when I saw it, a face just outside the window, staring back at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. It was there for only a moment before it vanished into the night, but that moment was enough to send me reeling backward, stumbling over my own feet as I tried to get away. I did not wait to see if they would come back. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to get the words out as I explained what had just happened. This time the dispatcher took me seriously, and within minutes there were flashing lights outside my house. But by the time the police arrived, whoever had been watching me was long gone. They searched the yard, the surrounding area, but found no trace of the intruder. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The officers suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, maybe with a friend or family member, but I had nowhere to go. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone what had been happening, too afraid they would think I was losing my mind. So I stayed in my house, but I did not sleep a wink. I sat in the dark, baseball bat in hand, waiting for whatever horror the night would bring next. The next morning, I felt like a walking zombie. The previous night had been a blur of fear and paranoia. I was exhausted but knew I had to keep my wits about me. I went through the motions of getting ready for work, but my mind was elsewhere, focused on the lingering dread that refused to lift. As I left for work, I took extra precautions. I checked and double-checked that all the doors were locked and all the windows secure. I even set up a camera in the living room, hoping it might catch anything unusual if the black SUV decided to make another appearance. It felt strange and unsettling, living under such constant surveillance in my own home. Work was a welcome distraction, but the constant buzzing of my phone and the nagging thought of what might be happening back at home made it hard to concentrate. I kept looking at my watch, counting down the hours until I could go back and check on things. When I finally got home, the anxiety was still there, gnawing at me. I pulled into the driveway, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of trouble. Everything seemed normal, but the sense of unease did not dissipate. I parked the car, took a deep breath, and headed inside. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I walked through each room, checking the locks and making sure everything was in place. The office curtains were still slightly parted, but there was no sign of anyone having been there. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched and went about my evening routine, determined to keep calm. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the basement. It was barely audible, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. My first thought was that it could be an animal, but the thought of someone or something being in my house made my skin crawl. I grabbed the baseball bat, my heart pounding in my chest, and crept down the stairs to the basement. The scratching sound continued, growing slightly louder as I approached. I shone a flashlight around, searching for the source of the noise. To my relief, I found nothing out of the ordinary, just some old boxes and tools. But then I noticed something unsettling. The basement window that had been securely closed the night before was slightly ajar. It was not open wide, just enough to let a breeze through. I had specifically remembered checking that window and ensuring it was locked. I pushed the window closed and secured it, my mind racing with possibilities. Could someone have been trying to get in through there? Were they still in the house? The fear was overwhelming, and I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I installed additional locks on all the doors and windows, and the camera in the living room became a permanent fixture. Despite my efforts to protect myself, the fear of the unknown continued to haunt me. One evening, as I was reviewing footage from the security camera, I noticed something disturbing. Around midnight, the camera had picked up a shadowy figure moving outside my front door. The figure seemed to linger for a few moments before disappearing into the darkness. It was too dark to make out any details, but the sight of that shadow was enough to make my blood run cold. I showed the footage to the police, but they were unable to identify the figure. They suggested it could have been a passerby or someone with no malicious intent. But the constant reminders of the black SUV and the threatening notes made it impossible for me to dismiss these events as mere coincidences. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started keeping a detailed journal of everything that happened, documenting every strange sound, every odd occurrence. I hoped that by piecing together the fragments, I might be able to make sense of the situation. One night, as I was writing in my journal, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I grabbed the baseball bat, creeping toward the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a young woman standing on my doorstep. She looked nervous and was clutching a piece of paper. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The woman introduced herself as a reporter from a local news station. She had heard about the incidents in my neighborhood and wanted to do a story on the strange occurrences. I was taken aback. How had she heard about it? Had the story spread? I invited her inside and we talked for a while. She seemed genuinely interested and concerned about what was happening. As we spoke, I learned that other residents in the area had also reported similar incidents: strange vehicles, eerie notes, and unexplained noises. The reporter promised to look into it and get back to me with any new information. I hoped her investigation would shed some light on the mystery, but as she left, I could not shake the feeling that her visit was just another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. As the days turned into weeks, the unsettling incidents continued. The black SUV made occasional appearances, always in the dead of night, but never with anyone getting out. The notes stopped, but the sense of dread never left. It was like living in a perpetual state of fear, with each day blending into the next. One evening, while going through the footage from my security camera, I noticed something chilling. There was a brief moment, just after midnight, when the camera caught a glimpse of a figure standing in my front yard. It was fleeting, but it looked like the same shadowy form I had seen before. I decided to take a closer look at the footage. As I replayed it, I noticed a pattern. The figure seemed to appear at the same time each night, always just before the black SUV showed up. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Desperate for answers, I reached out to the reporter, hoping she might have uncovered something new. To my surprise, she called me back that evening. She had found some information that might be relevant. It turned out that there had been a series of similar incidents in neighboring towns, all involving mysterious figures and threatening notes. The reporter mentioned that the incidents seemed to be connected to an old urban legend about a group known for terrorizing people in their homes. According to local lore, this group would target individuals at random, leaving cryptic messages and creating fear without ever making direct contact. The thought of an urban legend being real was both horrifying and relieving. At least it offered some explanation for the bizarre events. But it also meant that I was caught up in something much bigger than I had initially thought. As the nights grew longer and the fear continued to consume me, I knew that I had to remain vigilant. The shadowy figure, the black SUV, and the notes, they all pointed to something that went beyond mere coincidence. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. One night, as I was watching the footage from the security camera, I noticed something different. The shadowy figure appeared, but this time it was accompanied by another person. They stood in my yard for a while, seemingly discussing something before the black SUV arrived. I could not contain my anxiety. I decided to confront whatever was happening, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stay inside. I armed myself with the baseball bat and waited for the figure to make their move. The clock struck midnight and the familiar black SUV pulled up to my driveway. This time I was ready. I waited until the figure approached my front door, and then, gathering all my courage, I opened it. The figure, now clearly a man in a dark hoodie, stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I demanded to know what they wanted, but they only looked at me with an unreadable expression. Then in a voice that was almost a whisper, they said, "Derek is not the only one. We know who you are." Before I could respond, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The black SUV slowly drove off, and I was left standing there, stunned and terrified. I immediately called 911 again, but the dispatcher's voice was calm and distant, as if they did not fully grasp the gravity of the situation. I relayed everything that had happened, but the response was the same as before. Patrols would be increased, and I should call if anything else occurred. The encounter left me shaken, and I could not sleep that night. The man's words echoed in my mind. "We know who you are." It was as if they were trying to tell me something important, but I could not decipher their meaning. The next day, I received a call from the reporter. She had some new information about the urban legend and its connection to my situation. According to her sources, the group behind the threats was known for targeting people who had a specific connection to their past, a past that involved betrayal or unresolved conflicts. The reporter suggested that I dig into my own past and see if there were any connections. It was a suggestion that filled me with dread, but I had no other leads. I began to search through old records, personal documents, and even reached out to people I had not spoken to in years. It took weeks, but I finally uncovered something unsettling. Years ago, I had been involved in a business deal that had gone sour. There had been a dispute with a colleague, and while I thought it had been resolved, it seemed that not everyone agreed. As I delved deeper into my past, I uncovered something that made my blood run cold. The colleague I had a falling out with years ago, someone named Michael Reynolds, had a history of trouble. According to public records and old news articles, Michael had become involved with a shady group known for intimidation and harassment, similar to the behavior I had been experiencing. I learned that Michael had been part of a network that thrived on fear, targeting individuals who had wronged or crossed them in some way. It was a chilling realization. Could Michael Reynolds be the one behind the threats? The thought was both terrifying and somewhat relieving. It meant I had a possible lead, even if it was fraught with danger. Armed with this new information, I reached out to the police again, providing them with details about Michael Reynolds and his connections. They promised to look into it, but their response was cautious. They explained that Michael Reynolds was no longer directly involved with the group, but might still have connections or influence. The fear did not dissipate, though. Each night, I remained on edge, constantly checking the security footage and locking every door and window. The shadowy figure in the black SUV had become an almost nightly occurrence, always just out of reach. Then one evening, as I was going through the camera footage, I saw something that made my heart stop. The black SUV was parked outside my house, but this time, there was no shadowy figure. Instead, a woman, a younger woman with a familiar face, got out of the SUV and approached my front door. I recognized her instantly. It was someone I had seen at a company event years ago, someone who had been close to Michael Reynolds. My mind raced. What was she doing here? Why was she involved? That night, I decided I could not wait any longer. I had to confront whoever was behind this, even if it meant putting myself in danger. I waited in the shadows, baseball bat in hand, ready to face whatever, or whoever, was coming for me. At precisely midnight, the woman from the SUV returned. This time, she was accompanied by a man whose face was obscured by a hood. They approached my front door, and I could hear muffled voices. Gathering all my courage, I stepped out of the house and confronted them. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling but firm. The woman looked at me with a mixture of surprise and frustration. "We're here because of Michael Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying a note of bitterness. "He sent us to make sure you understood the consequences of your actions. Michael has his own way of settling scores, and you were caught in the crossfire." I felt a wave of anger and relief wash over me. "Why didn't you just come to me directly?" I asked. "Why all the threats and intimidation?" The man finally spoke, his voice cold and calculated. "Michael wanted you to be scared, to understand that your past actions have consequences. He's not here, but he wanted to make sure you got the message." I realized then that the whole ordeal had been a twisted form of retribution, a method of making me pay for something I thought was long in the past. The fear and anxiety, the nights of sleepless terror, it was all part of a game they had been playing. The confrontation ended with the two of them leaving, their message delivered. I was left standing there, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. It was over, but not in the way I had hoped. I had faced my fears and discovered the truth, but it had come at a steep cost. In the days that followed, things gradually returned to normal. The black SUV stopped appearing and the notes ceased. The police assured me that they would keep an eye on the situation, but I knew that the shadow of Michael Reynolds and his group would always be a part of my past. I learned to live with the knowledge that sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us no matter how hard we try to escape it. The terror of those nights would always linger in my memory, a reminder of the lengths to which fear can stretch. I moved forward with a cautious sense of peace, knowing that while the nightmares had ended, the echoes of that dark chapter would always be with me.